Good morning and welcome to today's session of Midweek Money Matters, 5 simple steps to take if you become a victim of fraud or identity theft. You've all been muted as you enter this morning. At the end of today's session, if you have questions, I'm happy to unmute you, or you may unmute yourself to ask any questions. If you have questions throughout, you may place them in the chat. So let's go ahead and get started. We're talking today about the 5 simple steps you need to take if you become a victim of a fraud or identity theft. This session is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, and we are thrilled to have you here today. So let's start off thinking about if we've ever had our identity stolen, or maybe we gave money to someone and it turned out that they were taking advantage and stealing our hard-earned money. Maybe you've had unauthorized transactions on your accounts, or even worse, maybe you've had a new account opened in your name without your authorization. Any of these things that I've outlined could indicate that you may have become a victim of a scam, fraud, or identity theft. But it's important that you understand that you are certainly not alone. It is something that is happening more and more frequently. We're going to see here, according to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, they have a reporting database called the Consumer Sentinel Network Reports. Now, mind you that this data is only for January 1st through December 2nd of this year. And these are only the reports of COVID-19 or stimulus frauds and scams. In Pennsylvania alone, there were more than 10,000 reported frauds and scams. We've lost a total of $14.6 million. And you can see here that general fraud in and of itself had 6,720 victims. And those are the ones that actually reported to the Federal Trade Commission. And we're going to talk shortly about how important it is for us to report to the Federal Trade Commission and other agencies. But what I found the most problematic, or the problem that I have the most, is that median loss. The median loss in Pennsylvania was $482, but the national average is $324. That's a difference of $160 per, on the average. And that's just for Pennsylvania. I find that to be incredibly alarming. And that's one of the reasons that I think that these events are so incredibly important, because this is how we can spread the word and share information to let people know when there are, what to do when things like this happen. Because one of the biggest things that I hear about, and you have to understand, I've done outreach for quite a few years, and if we don't know what to do as consumers, we're at a loss. But at the same time, as a government agency, if we don't know about a problem, there's nothing that can be done to fix it. So reporting becomes critical. Whoops. So we're going to just talk very quickly. These are the 5 steps that I'm going to outline today. We want to make sure we stop the loss. It's got to be reported. Checking our credit becomes critical, and not being embarrassed and keeping that notebook are also vital. So let's go ahead and get started with the 5 steps. The first step we have to take is we absolutely have to stop the loss. We have to notify the company that is involved, whether that is your bank or credit union, maybe a credit card company. One scam or one fraud that happens more often than people realize is that individuals open cell phones in someone else's name. It's something that's relatively easy to do, and unfortunately, it can really wreak financial havoc on individuals. So that's something that we need to be aware of. And the last thing I really think, we don't necessarily realize what a problem it is, but there are individuals who will open new accounts in our names. Now, a new account could be a credit card. It can also be something major like a car purchase or even a mortgage. Years ago, I met a woman who told me that um, she had recently found out that her sister had stolen her identity and actually purchased a home. She took out a mortgage in this woman's name, and the woman was devastated, mostly because it was her sister. But she also found that at that point her credit had been ruined because the sister had lost her job and wasn't making her mortgage payments anymore. So it's really, really important that we're aware of our credit, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of slides. But the first thing that we need to do is notify whatever company we're talking about, and let them know that you've been a victim of a fraud, scam, or identity theft, so that you can put an end to this, to what's happening. If you ever taken a first aid class, first thing you have to do is you have to stop the bleed. When you're a victim of a fraud or scam, the first thing that you have to do is stop the loss. The next thing so when you contact the company, you have to actually be prepared to give them as much information as they need. It's not uncommon that the company is going to want oodles of information. You're going to need to be prepared to tell them what happened. How and when did you find out that it had happened, whether that's the unauthorized transaction or a brand new account, or that you used your card to purchase gift cards through so you have to be able to tell them what happened, and you have to give them your accurate contact information, because they're going to want to get in touch with you again. And finally, you're going to be required to provide them with proof of what you're saying. And that's going to involve a couple of different things. First of all, it's going to provide proof to what you're telling the company has happened. Um, and so you're going to need to provide copies of police reports that we'll talk about on the next slide. But, whatever information that you have that made you aware of the fact that you had become a victim is going to be really important. So then the next step that you have to take, and we're up to step 2, is you have to report it. And sadly, you have to report it 3 separate times at least. The first time that you report it, you're going to report it to your local police. If you don't have a local police department, that's going to be the Pennsylvania State Police. And the reason that you have to do that, there's 2 reasons. The first is that, remember in step 1, I said we have to provide proof of what we're saying. That police report gives us that proof. The second reason is that the reality is that our local police know about what's happening in our community, and helping them to be aware of what's happening in the community not only will help you, but they can also see if there are trends within the community, so that the law enforcement officers can make the public aware, and also so that they can see those trends for investigative purposes. Now, the next report we have to make is to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. Now, I mentioned that our local police know what's happening in our town or municipality. If you live in the Harrisburg area, that's the area that they're familiar with. The Pennsylvania Attorney General has jurisdiction over the whole state. So they're going to know what's happening everywhere between Erie, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and all the cities and boroughs in between. So that's going to help them to see what's happening throughout the Commonwealth. But we have to take it a step further, and we have to report it to the Federal Trade Commission, because the Federal Trade Commission has jurisdiction over the whole United States. The Attorney General sees what's happening maybe in Philadelphia and Levittown, but they don't see what's happening in Jersey and Delaware or California or whatever, whatever state that they're investigating. So it's important that we report it to them as well. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind is that what's great about the Federal Trade Commission report is that information goes into that Sentinel that we talked about in that first or second slide. Now, one thing that is really important that we understand is that I've actually spoken to the Postal Inspection Service, who tells me that they use information that goes to the Federal Trade Commission to detect trends and actually trigger investigations. So it's critical that we really do report it to each of these three steps. Your local police, because the local part of it, the Attorney General, because they're the highest state law enforcement available, and then finally that Federal Trade Commission that has the fuller jurisdiction. So let's talk about step 3. Step 3 requires that we check our credit report. Now, if you have found a few unauthorized transactions on your credit card or your debit card, it may not be quite as critical, but it is important that we check our credit report at least once a year from each of the 3 credit reporting bureaus. And that's because if there's anything that's happening that we're not aware of, that's where we're going to actually see that. So make sure that you're checking that. And one of the things that I think is really terrific is that in the midst of this pandemic that we found ourselves in 2020, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion have begun offering access to our credit reports once a week. So that's a really great way for us to be able to monitor, particularly for those of us who have struggled with job loss or are maybe struggling to make payments, that being able to monitor what's happening on our credit can really be helpful as far as maintaining our good credit. So when you pull your credit report, what exactly are you looking for? Excuse me. The first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you check all of the personal information. Your credit report is going to have any combination of name that you've ever used in your in applying for credit. It's going to have addresses that you've had since you were maybe 18 years old. It's going to have telephone numbers, employers. There's lots of information, lots of personal information that you may not realize is on your credit report. So you have to make sure that all of that is correct, because something that's not correct could be an indication that you've been a victim of identity theft or some other form of fraud. Then you want to look at existing credit limits and their balances, because it's not uncommon for criminals to contact a credit company and say, this is Katrina Boyer. I have a family emergency, or I have a need for an increased line in my credit card, or my line of credit, and ask for an increase in that. And unfortunately, it's not that difficult for people to gather enough information that they can convince the company that they're us. And if I've been a good customer, they would be likely to increase that limit. Now, if I'm not aware of that, that person may actually be able to shop using my personal information and cause me a whole lot of financial heartache. And then that third step we need to take is we actually need to look for those accounts that may not be ours. That is that, remember I mentioned earlier the woman whose sister stole her identity, and and took out a mortgage. Had she pulled her credit report, she would have seen very early on an account that wasn't hers for a mortgage, and that would have given her, that red flag that she needed to figure out what was going on. And it really could have avoided a whole lot of stress on her behalf, because she could have put an end to it before her credit had been ruined. So making sure that there are no accounts, that all of the accounts on your report is critical. If you see something that's not right, it's important that you contact each of the 3 credit reporting bureaus, and their contact information is here. If you would like copies of today's presentation with all the links, telephone numbers, and resources, at the end, you'll see my email address, and you'll be able to email, and I'm happy to send this out to whomever may need it. So if there's something not right, you need to contact all 3 credit reporting bureaus, because computers don't always communicate the way they're supposed to. So keep that in mind when they tell you that if you report it to one, they'll report it to the other 2. The reality is that this is your personal information. This is your integrity that you want to make sure um, is accurate. So make sure that you report it to all 3. Now, the 4th step is something that you have to take and keep it going. From the moment you figure out that you've become a victim of a fraud or scam until long after it's over, you have to keep a notebook. That notebook goes a long way in helping to keep everything straight. Studies show that victims of financial theft, or a financial crime, are just as victimized as victims of a violent crime. So, but the reality is it's just a different type of, emotion. So it's critical that we keep that notebook. And when we keep that notebook, first we want to start with recording the date and time we do anything. Who do I talk to? When I called ABC credit card company, I spoke to operator, whatever the numbers are, whose name was Jane Smith. And this is what we talked about. And Miss Smith gave me this report or file number. And then as you start to get mail, make sure that you keep that correspondence in the notebook. And this is why it's really important. Remember I mentioned that the Postal Inspection Service gets information from the Sentinel to figure out trends in crime? Well, 2 years ago, I was talking with someone from the Postal Inspection Service, and they told me that they had seen a trend of identity thefts that had taken place 5 years before. And they were starting to investigate it by reaching out to the victims who had reported 5 years ago. Now, I have a really hard time remembering what happened 5 days ago, let alone what I did 5 years ago. So keeping this notebook indefinitely will help us to be able to recall and provide very important information to law enforcement that may be investigating the crime. So keeping that notebook goes a long way. Not only that, keeping it can help us when we go to apply for credit. If maybe we're buying a new car and something comes up on our credit report that doesn't seem right, we can provide it to the credit company and share information about our theft, the crime that happened against us, and that can help us actually be approved for the loan that we were looking for. So make sure that you keep that notebook for a long period of time. Now, step number 5, whatever happens, do not be embarrassed about what has happened to you. Many people are too embarrassed to admit that they've had a problem, and so they don't speak up. And what happens when we do that is that number one, we can't recover from it. If we don't report it, there's no chance we're going to get our money back. But also, many people are embarrassed and don't report. So the reality is that law enforcement and agencies like mine, or older adult protective services, areas agencies on aging, don't know how deep the problem is in their community. So not being embarrassed is critical. I can't tell you how many medical professionals, law enforcement officers, well-educated people who have become victims and are embarrassed to admit it because, well, they may lose their integrity or people may think less of them. But the reality is we can all become that victim at some point in our lives, and that's important for us to remember. And then the other half of that is to talk to someone that you trust. As I said, this is an incredibly emotional time. So talking to a loved one, talking to a medical professional or someone else that you trust can go a long way in helping you to feel better and make sure that you haven't hopefully forgotten to report it to someone else. Now, the Federal Trade Commission has a fantastic website. It's identitytheft.gov. And they actually have a survey that you can complete, and then it will allow you to download an identity theft recovery plan. When we are under normal circumstances, I actually keep a printed version of this on hand so that I can send it out to consumers that I meet or provide it at sessions like this that are in person. It's a step-by-step guide. It's kind of like a workbook from when we were in elementary school, but it becomes that proof, that notebook that I talked about in our Keep a Notebook step 4. So this recovery plan can be very helpful for those of us who are looking for something that's more structured as we start the recovery process. Now, for those of you who are new to Midweek Money Matters, I think it's incredibly important to provide resources because my 30-minute session only can provide so much. There are clearly way more resources and things that can be shared, but a 30-minute time frame is a 30-minute time frame. So you can actually locate your local police department by going to policelocator.com/PA. Now, if you live in a small community or a community that's not represented by its own law enforcement, you can go to psp.pa.gov and you can find your local police barracks where you would want to report, where you would want to start that process. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office is attorneygeneral.gov. Remember, you have to report to all 3 agencies. The local or state police, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, and the Federal Trade Commission. To report scams or identity theft to the Federal Trade Commission, it's consumer.ftc.gov. Again, these are all really great resources. If you would like copies of today's session, we're happy to send them to you. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't suggest that we all take the time to freeze our credit reports. Freezing our credit effectively stops anyone from being able to open new credit in our name without us knowing about it. So basically what happens when you place your credit freeze, anyone who tries to access your credit gets the message that there's no information or that the report has been frozen. And then that gives us the opportunity to go in either online or over the phone to lift that freeze if we are, in fact, the ones who are applying for new credit. So let's say you come across a deal on a new vehicle, and you decide that it's time for you to get that new car. You can lift the freeze on your credit report. It has to be done within an hour, and then you're able to make that purchase or shop for that insurance or apply for that new job. But what's really great is it stops that new credit from being opened. And it's super easy and free. After the Equifax breach of 2018, the federal government mandated that each of the credit reporting bureaus allow for consumers to freeze their credit at no cost. You go in, you create your account, and you can place or lift your freeze at any time. When you place it, the company has 24 hours to get the freeze in place. When you lift it, they have to have it lifted within an hour. And you can do it, as I said, either through the link or by calling those numbers that you can see on your screen. Our Office of Consumer Services are always available during regular business hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, except on holidays. But what's really great about them is that they're specially trained to deal with consumers who are facing some form of financial difficulty, whether they've been a victim of a fraud or scam, whether they're not sure about their investment professional, whether something may have happened to their with their accounts at their financial institutions. They're happy to help callers understand what may be happening with their accounts or help them with knowing what steps they should take going forward. And the great thing is, it's an easy number to remember. It's 1-800-PA-BANKS if you're local, or if you're in Pennsylvania. And what's really cool is that a real life person answers the call. There's no menu options, 1 for this or 2 for that. As long as one of our staff are available at the time, they'll answer. Now, if they are all on the phone at the same time, which happens occasionally, you'll be asked to leave a message. And once you leave that message, someone will return your call. Before we go to questions, I did see a couple of questions pop up through today's chat box. I will go back to those. But before we answer live questions, I just want to go on to the next slide. This is my contact information. I can be reached at katrboyer@pa.gov. I appreciate you having joined us for today's Midweek Money Matters presentation on the 5 steps we need to take if we become a victim. It has been a pleasure chatting with you. I am going to stop the recording for today, and then we'll go back and answer any questions.